Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive into today's chapter, here's a quick recap of where we left off. Karun, the elder son of the patriarch, sat in quiet contemplation, his gaze sharp, his tone laced with suspicion. He turned to his butler, voice low and probing. Raon might be dead? The butler, ever composed, offered a calm reply. He spoke of the situation with measured words, even touching on Limer's efforts to gather intel from the patriarch himself. Karun's lips curled into a satisfied grin. Nice, he said, almost too casually. He'd always been a bother. I'm glad he's gone, without me having to lift a finger. But the butler's voice grew heavier with concern. There's talk of Raon clashing with the Blue Spirit, he said. I'm wondering if Eden was behind the attack. Karun leaned back, his tone still light, almost amused. That's possible. I'm sure he was a nuisance for them too. If you're new here or need a refresher, I highly recommend checking out the previous chapter before diving into this one. Now that we're all caught up, let's dive into this new chapter. The morning sun cast a golden hue over Zieghardt's graduation grounds, where anticipation hung thick in the air. One by one, people began to gather, families, instructors, and curious onlookers, drawn by the promise of celebration and new beginnings. Today marked the long-awaited graduation ceremony of the 5th Training Hall. Inside the grounds, the atmosphere was electric. Trainees, now clad in crisp ceremonial uniforms, filled the space with laughter and chatter. Their faces glowed with pride, their voices rang with joy, each one a testament to the trials they'd overcome. In the sea of spectators, one figure stood out, Sylvia, her brows furrowed with concern. Her eyes scanned the crowd anxiously, searching for a familiar face. She leaned toward her maid, her voice trembling with unease. Where's Raon? It's his graduation today. If they begin without him, does that mean? Helen, ever composed, offered a gentle smile. Her voice was calm, reassuring, like a steady breeze cutting through Sylvia's storm of worry. Ma'am, they won't proceed with the graduation without the head trainee. So please, don't worry too much. Meanwhile, another presence settled into the spectator seats with quiet authority. Karun, the elder son of the patriarch, sat with an air of composed confidence. Among the clusters of graduates, 2 trainees stood side by side, their voices tinged with disbelief and pride. The day's finally here, one said, eyes scanning the ceremonial grounds. We're actually graduating, the other chuckled, a trace of old fear in his voice. Finally. When I was sent out on that mission, I honestly thought, am I going to die like this? They both laughed, the kind of laugh that only survivors share. The first trainee added with a grin, I feel like we could even take down ogres now, easy. But their moment of reflection was cut short by a sharp, familiar voice. Hey, you guys. Ben, the ever-serious second head trainee, strode up behind them, arms crossed and tone firm. It's almost time for graduation. Why are you wasting time chatting over here? The trainees turned, startled but smiling. One of them blurted out, Ben. Ben stood tall, his posture rigid with authority. Watching the trainees linger, he couldn't help but slip into his usual commanding tone. Stop being careless, he barked. Return to your seats. The trainees straightened instinctively, voices rising in unison like a well-rehearsed drill. Yes, understood. Without another word, they turned and marched off, their earlier laughter replaced by disciplined silence. Ben watched them go, his stern expression softening just a touch. A quiet sigh escaped his lips as he murmured to himself, barely audible over the crowd's hum. I wonder when they'll finally mature. Lost in thought, Ben stood silently, watching the trainees return to their seats. His sigh lingered in the air, a quiet echo of his inner reflections. Then, a familiar voice broke through, playful, teasing, and unmistakably sharp. I thought you'd change at least a little. The voice said, drawing closer, but it looks like you're just as stiff as always. Ben didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as his eyes met the speaker's. Speak for yourself, he replied coolly. Seems like that harsh mouth of yours shows no signs of improving. Martha stormed across the graduation grounds, muttering under her breath as she wrestled with her unruly hair. Her stride was fierce, her presence unmistakable. Who cares? She snapped, brushing a stubborn strand aside as she reached Ben. Harsh mouth or not, it doesn't matter. Ben turned to face her, his gaze steady, landing on the confident smirk etched across her face. He sighed, the weight of experience behind his words. That attitude might be fine for now, he said, but once you graduate, they won't let it slide, especially during outings. You're always itching to pick fights over everything. Martha's grin widened, defiant and unbothered. If I just beat them up each time, she said with a shrug, they'll stop yapping, right? Ben's eyes narrowed slightly as he gazed at Martha, a hint of a challenge in his voice. "Let's see how long your confidence lasts," he muttered. "Anyway." His voice trailed off as he turned toward the entrance of the graduation grounds. The ceremony was moments away, yet something gnawed at him. His gaze lingered on the gate, worry creeping into his expression. "I wonder why Raon isn't here yet," he said under his breath. "The graduation is starting soon." A doubt crept into his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder, did he really get ambushed by Eden or something? As Ben's doubts lingered in the air, a firm voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Raon will definitely come back." Runan approached with steady steps, her eyes unwavering, her voice laced with conviction. "There's no way Raon would lose to people like them." Ben and Martha turned in unison, caught off guard by her sudden declaration. Surprise flickered across their faces. Martha raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp and unapologetic. "Well, how would you know?" She crossed her arms, a sly smirk playing on her lips. "Honestly, it'd be better if Raon doesn't come back. That way, I get to be the representative instead." Runan froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. She stared at Martha, stunned, not just by the words, but by the cold ambition behind them. Runan's eyes flared with fury, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "No! Raon will definitely come back," she shouted, fists clenched. "Don't speak so recklessly like that." Martha didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her tone sharp and unapologetic. "It's already too late," she snapped. "If he was going to come, he'd be here by now." The clash of voices echoed across the graduation grounds, drawing glances from nearby trainees. The tension between them crackled like lightning in a storm. Ben, caught between their fury, placed a hand on his forehead and groaned. Calm down, both of you." Butler Lowen's booming voice echoed through the graduation grounds, silencing the chatter of the students. "The graduation ceremony is about to start. All graduating trainees should go to their assigned positions." The three of them, Martha, Ben, and Runan, were taken aback by the sudden interruption, their argument forgotten in the face of the impending ceremony. Their eyes drifted towards the Patriarch's throne, where Butler Lowen stood, resplendent in his formal attire. As they watched, Zieghardt's eternal son, the rightful owner of the North, strode towards his throne, his presence commanding attention. He seated himself regally, his piercing gaze sweeping across the crowd. Butler Lowen's voice rang out once more. "Patriarch Glenn Zieghardt is entering." The entire assembly erupted into a thunderous greeting, their voices rising in unison as they bowed to the Patriarch. "Greetings, Patriarch." As the crowd settled and the ceremony prepared to begin, Instructor Limer stepped forward, his expression tight with concern. He approached the towering throne where Patriarch Glenn Zieghardt sat, his voice hesitant. Patriarch," Limer began, "two trainees haven't returned yet. Could you wait just a bit longer?" Glenn's gaze was cold, unwavering, his voice cut through the air like steel. "No." He leaned forward slightly, his tone firm and absolute. "Even if we did not determine an exact return date, they were notified that the graduation would be in February. Thus, if they haven't returned by now, they do not meet the qualifications to graduate." The Patriarch's eyes narrowed, his words laced with quiet authority. "You wouldn't seriously be suggesting that we delay the graduation for those who haven't returned yet, would you, Chief Instructor Limer?" Limer stood frozen, the weight of Glenn's judgment pressing down on him. Words failed him. The crowd watched in silence as the instructor, usually so composed, was left speechless. Instructor Limer turned to face the gathered trainees, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of decision. "Then we will proceed with the graduation," he announced. "The ceremony will be conducted by the Patriarch and all the family elders." A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd as Limer continued. "We will now begin the final roll call before the ceremony starts." Then, Limer's tone shifted. 43 students in total, 41 present, and 2 missing. A hush fell over the trainees. Whispers broke out like sparks in dry grass. "Is Raon really not coming?" One trainee murmured to another. "We're really starting like this," another added. Disbelief etched into their voice. Limer raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "Roll call complete," he declared. "We will begin the graduation ceremony." Then, with finality, he turned to the guards in order. "Please close the gates." Runan, Martha, and Ben stood frozen, their eyes locked on the narrowing gap. A flicker of hope danced behind their worried expressions. "This is it," they thought. "If Raon doesn't come now, it's over." The heavy gates groaned as they began to close, sealing the graduation grounds with finality. The sound echoed like a verdict across the courtyard. But just as the gates were about to shut, they jolted to a stop, the sound of scraping metal echoing through the air. The sudden halt of the gates sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Murmurs rose like wind through tall grass. Wait, why did the gates stop? One trainee whispered. Isn't this the first time they've ever stopped mid-close? Another added, eyes wide. Is there a problem or something? A third chimed in, voice tinged with unease. Then, from beyond the threshold, a lone figure stepped forward, Raon clad in his graduation uniform. He walked with quiet resolve. His eyes scanned the grounds, taking in the sea of trainees, the elders, the towering throne, and the stunned silence that greeted him. The trainees turned, one by one, as if drawn by an unseen force. Gasps echoed, eyes widened. As the crowd erupted in whispers and gasps, Raon stepped forward, his presence calm yet commanding. All eyes were on him, but his voice carried a quiet humility. I wasn't trying to draw this much attention to myself, he said, glancing around at the stunned trainees and elders. Instructor Limer exhaled deeply, the tension finally lifting from his shoulders. He murmured under his breath, half amused, half relieved. Even if you're late, this is just really late. That guy really is the best at making us worry. Raon stood tall, his gaze steady as he faced the Patriarch's throne and the gathered assembly. Raon Zieghardt reporting, he declared, I've returned. The words rang out like a bell, clear, resolute, and undeniable. The moment Raon stepped onto the graduation grounds, the tension shattered. Runan, Ben, and Martha dashed toward him, their emotions spilling over. Raon. Runan called out, her voice trembling with relief. Raon Zieghardt. Ben echoed, eyes wide with disbelief. Runan reached him first, grabbing his hand tightly, her voice softened, filled with emotion. I was waiting for you, Raon. Raon smiled gently, his tone apologetic but calm. Sorry, I came back a bit later than expected. Ben's face twisted in exasperation. What do you mean a bit? Martha stepped in, her voice sharp with frustration. You almost failed, idiot. Aren't you the head trainee? How can you be so late? Behind them, poor Dorian stood awkwardly, watching the reunion unfold. He sighed internally, shoulders slumping. Hey, I'm also here, he thought, quietly fading into the background. Raon walked toward Instructor Limer, his steps steady, the weight of his late arrival still lingering in the air. Limer exhaled, the tension easing just slightly from his shoulders. Anyway, he said with a sigh, I'm glad you're back, Raon. Raon offered a respectful nod. Sorry about that, Instructor. Limer gestured toward the front of the formation. Get in your spot already, everyone's waiting for you. Since you're the head trainee, you should be up front. Raon turned and began walking toward his designated position. Then a voice rang out, sharp and commanding, stop. The words sliced through the graduation grounds like a blade. Raon froze mid-step. Limer turned sharply, eyes narrowing as he searched for the source. Among the spectators, seated beside the elders, stood a figure cloaked in quiet authority. Limer's heart sank, his thoughts raced. Karun Zieghardt. Karun stepped forward from the spectators section, his voice clear and calculated as he addressed the throne. Patriarch, he began, the other trainees returned and proved their qualifications a month ago, but Raon has only just arrived. Since we haven't verified whether he succeeded or not, I don't think he should graduate right now. A hush fell over the grounds. All eyes turned to Glenn Zieghardt, the Patriarch, whose expression remained unreadable. You're not wrong, Glenn replied after a pause, his voice deep and deliberate, but the decision on whether he passes this graduation ceremony will be made by the instructor, based on his conduct over the past year. Karun's eyes narrowed. He wasn't finished, however, he pressed. Raon Zieghardt, who has just arrived, has not proven anything. I'm sure he isn't going to make everyone here wait until his qualifications are proven. Then, with a cold gaze fixed on Raon, Karun spoke with authority, leave. The tension hung thick in the air as Karun's command echoed across the graduation grounds, but Instructor Limer stepped forward, his voice unwavering, his gaze locked on the Patriarch. Patriarch, training ground master, he declared, I can prove Raon's qualifications right here. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Limer turned to Raon, eyes steady. Right, Raon. Raon stood frozen, stunned by the sudden challenge. His lips parted, but no words came. Without another word, Limer and Raon began to prepare for a duel. The air was electric with tension as they drew their swords, the blades glinting in the light. The two combatants charged at each other, their swords clashing in a flurry of steel and sparks. As they fought, their auras seemed to collide, creating a massive shockwave that rippled through the air. The spectators were caught off guard, their faces contorted in shock as they stumbled backward. The shockwave from their collision still rippled through the air, leaving the crowd stunned. Martha's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as she stared at the unfolding fight between Limer and Raon. What? She exclaimed, her voice barely above a whisper. No way. I was sure Raon's ability was only at the expert level. She turned to Ben, her face pale with astonishment. On the field, Limer's voice rang out, firm and resolute. Swordsmen speak with their swords. His wind aura surged, swirling around him like a storm ready to break. Raon sneered, his eyes flashing with determination. What an appropriate statement, he retorted, his own aura erupting in a blaze of fiery energy. Flames danced around his blade, heat radiating from his stance. Their blades collided once more, wind and fire clashing in a dazzling spectacle of light and sound. The force of their auras surged upward, spiraling into the sky. A brilliant spear of combined energy burst forth, streaking into the heavens. Then boom, it erupted like a firecracker, scattering radiant colors across the sky, crimson and emerald, gold and sapphire. Each hue danced above the graduation grounds, painting the moment with awe. The crowd gasped, stunned by the beauty and power of the clash. Among the spectators, Sylvia watched with wide eyes, her lips curled into a delighted smile. Beside her, her maid clapped softly, joy sparkling in her gaze. Karun's eyes widened in stunned disbelief as he stared at the aftermath of the clash. No matter how much Limer's body has been damaged, that is not an attack a trainee should ever be able to block, he thought to himself. A mixture of shock and curiosity washed over him. Just what happened during the time he was gone? He wondered, his mind racing with possibilities. Meanwhile, the trainees and spectators were having the time of their lives. Their faces lit up with excitement and joy. They gazed up at the sky, mesmerized by the spectacular display of elemental energy still resonating from the clash. The clash had ended, the sky still glowing with the remnants of wind and fire. Silence fell over the graduation grounds as Raon lowered his sword and turned toward Karun. This should be enough evidence, he said, his voice calm but firm. Karun's jaw tightened, teeth grinding in frustration, his eyes locked onto Raon, disbelief still flickering behind his glare. Raon tilted his head slightly, a teasing smile tugging at his lips. Right, training ground master? The words struck like a final blow, not of disrespect, but of undeniable truth. Karun's fists clenched at his sides, but there was nothing left to argue, no ground to stand on. With a bitter scowl, he turned and sat down, his silence louder than any protest. The dust had barely settled when Instructor Limer turned toward the throne, laughter in his voice and pride in his eyes. My lord, he said with a grin, I feel like this is enough qualification, so, could we start the graduation ceremony now? Patriarch Glenn Zieghardt leaned back in his throne, surveying the battered training ground with a raised brow. You're so shameless, he replied dryly, look at the state you left the training ground in. A pause, then, with a faint smirk tugging at his lips, he added, I'll ask my questions about Raon after the graduation is over. He raised his hand, voice echoing with finality. Head Instructor Limer, proceed with the graduation of the 5th Training Hall. Limer bowed slightly, his smile widening. Beside him, Raon stood tall, his gaze meeting the patriarch's with quiet confidence. Instructor Limer's voice rang out across the training grounds, firm and proud. Now, head trainee, Raon Zieghardt to the front. Raon nodded and slowly walked towards his designated position, his eyes fixed on Limer. He reached his position at the front of the formation, standing tall. Behind him, the other trainees lined up, their faces glowing with joy and pride. The unity was palpable. 43 warriors, forged together. Limer turned to the crowd, his voice rising with ceremonial clarity. 5th Training Hall, 43 students in total, 43 present, and no absentees. Limer's voice boomed once more. We will thus begin the graduation ceremony of the 5th Training Hall's trainees. The atmosphere was electric, filled with anticipation and celebration as the trainees prepared to mark this momentous occasion in their lives. Hey friends, before we wrap up, I want to say something personal. Sorry for the delay in posting. My father was hospitalized for over 2 months, and I didn't have the time or energy to create videos. Please keep him in your prayers. Now, this chapter comes to an end, and with it, Season 2. To everyone watching, thank you for joining us on this adventure. Your support means the world. Let me know in the comments, should I start a new Manhwa recap, or continue with It Starts with the Kingpin account? I already uploaded 200. If you'd like to support the channel and be part of our growing family, consider joining as a member, and don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know and keeps this community thriving. Until next time, stay tuned.